We're thinking about being humble and holy today. Welcome as we look again into the life of Elisabeth Elliot, who called us to live to a higher standard each day, to not be satisfied with just second best when we could have God's best in our lives. We'll be hearing today from a family member and a good friend of Elisabeth as they talk about what they've learned from her life. Welcome. Well, as we gather today for two Gateway to Joy programs, let me remind you that the schedule calls for parts 3 and 4 of a series called Humble Things. Humble things can be holy things and an unwritten language. Also, we'll be hearing from Elisabeth Martin, one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot, who will talk about her granny's southern accents, about being overwhelmed, about imitation done with a good heart. Also, a good friend of Elisabeth, Kathy Gilbert, joins us to talk about what Elisabeth did that showed her humility and her sacrifice in a very simple way. That coming later. First, though, let's begin with part 3 of our series, Humble Things. Elisabeth will continue telling us about some of her missionary experiences on the foreign field, about a thatched roof, a creaking home with bats and bugs.
In our last talk, I was describing to you my arrival in the jungle, the western jungle of Ecuador, as a new missionary in 1952. I went to work with two English women named Doreen and Barbara, who were working with a tribe called the Colorados. Their language had never been reduced to writing, these Indians, and Doreen and Barbara didn't quite know how to go about it, and I had had special training along that line. So they had invited me and my colleague Dorothy, who was going to sort of run a little school for Indian children there, to come and work with them. And so we'd arrived at Doreen's house, and we'd had a very tasty lunch of spinach soup and rice and fried eggs and tea. And then we were introduced to our house, Dorothy and me. It was a huge barn-like house that had been built by E.T., another missionary with a wife and family, who were now living in the town of Santo Domingo. So we moved into this big, empty, barn-like place, sort of creaking when we went up the stairs. It had a thatched roof, and the walls didn't quite reach the roof, so there was a large space between the top of the walls and the roof that I learned very quickly admitted all sorts of creatures like bats and bugs. And I had a bedroom to myself, quite spacious. There was a double bed there, but it only had a single mattress, so it was kind of an odd-looking bed. There was no such thing as a dresser, but I learned that kerosene boxes made very nice dressers. You just stacked up 3 kerosene boxes on their sides and put a little curtain in front, and I put a old-fashioned linen towel that my mother had given me on the top of it, and that made a very civilized-looking cover. And then I set my bottle of Tweed cologne, which I had been wearing for a number of years and made me feel very civilized. Not that I used it very often in the jungle, but it sort of gave me a cozy feeling just to have a little touch of home like that on top of the linen cover, on top of my dresser made of kerosene boxes. There was no closet, so I just hung up a plastic clothes bag, and I had brought with me from the States a little tiny red fireman's lantern, which I hung on a nail on the wall, and that was the only light in the room. I found an empty jar somewhere, not that there were many of those around, they were pretty precious, but I suppose E.T. or his wife had left an empty jar somewhere in the house, and I went out and found some vines and put those in the jar, just to make a place of order and peace, and, as much as possible, of beauty. The kitchen in that house was something else. There was a fogon. Well, a fogon is nothing but a wooden sandbox on legs. On the sand, you build a fire, just as you would on the ground. There was a bar, a wooden bar across the top, on which you could hang a pot over the fire, but it was a primitive stove, very primitive to say the least. Then in the dining room we had a huge table, sort of like a picnic table, and then there were a few chairs of the sort that one used to see outdoors in Bible conferences when I was a kid, those slanted seat, wooden slat chairs. I think maybe you know the ones I'm talking about. Very large, very ungainly, not exactly what you would think of as living room furniture, but in such a huge barn-like house, it fit quite well. I thought about the fact that when Jesus was here on earth, he loved what must have been a very humble home. It was not his home, it was the home of 3 very dear friends, and they were all single people. Did you ever think of that? Mary and Martha and Lazarus were, as far as we know, single. And these 3 had made a home, a place of refuge and peace for Jesus. I don't suppose for a moment that it was a very fancy place. We know that Martha did the cooking, so they must not have had servants. And I suppose they had fixed a little room for Jesus somewhere. But we know from the Gospels that he resorted to that place of peace, not just once, but many times. And if Jesus graced that humble home with his presence, doesn't it tell us something about how important or how unimportant material things are? Very humble things can be very holy things. Very ordinary things can be very full of God. Well, I want to tell you about our Sunday morning meetings. We were missionaries, of course, and as I told you, Doreen and Barbara had been working in this area for some years, so there was a small group of believers. They were white people, not the Colorado Indians yet, although today there is a group of Colorado Indians that form a church. But you can't imagine anything much less formal than the little Sunday morning church service that we had in San Miguel. It was patterned on what might be called Plymouth Brethren lines, as simply following the New Testament pattern as possible. There was nothing formal about it, and yet it had its own unvarying form or liturgy. The brethren, as they called themselves, met in a schoolroom which occupied the ground floor of our house, and they sat around in a modified circle, and there was a table in the middle on which was a whole loaf of bread and a cup of wine. There was not one minister, but anyone who felt led of the Spirit could stand up and speak, as long as he was a male, or they could give out a hymn or lead in prayer. And after there had been a few hymns sung and a few words of Scripture read, then they would break the bread. The meeting was very often interrupted by dogs barking, children crying, women getting up to see who was going by, men leaving their seats in order to spit out the door or the window, or perhaps smoke a cigarette or wander around outside for a little while until they felt like coming back in. The distractions were endless. I think of what an unimpressive show it would have been for anybody who was looking for a church. It was a scraggly-looking group of the poor and humble, many of them barefooted, some of the women nursing babies or fussing with toddlers. You might ask, could the presence of God be here? Would Almighty God dwell in the midst of a company like this? And this question did occur to me quite often when the physical appearances threatened all spiritual sensibility. Sometimes the whole thing seemed absolutely farcical. And yet, in my saner moments, I knew that there was a reality here. In the greatest simplicity, there were a few true believers who had come together to give testimony to their belief. They saw through a glass darkly, but they were followers of the true light. And God does come and dwell with men. One of the most beautiful names of God is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And when Jesus left his disciples, he had said to them, "This do in remembrance of me." And he then gave them the bread which represented his body and the cup, the sign of his blood. And so this simple little church, this humble gathering of simple people, was in fact the real heart of our life together. Well, I could go into endless details about jungle housekeeping. When we talk about getting back to the simple life, we have to realize we'd be getting back to a very complicated way of doing things by comparison with some of the conveniences that we have. Did you ever think about the blessing of piped water? Well, if you have to collect all of your water from a thatched roof, you get what looks like tea in the first place, and there will be quite a few creatures and foreign objects floating in the water, which either have to be sieved out or strained out or filtered out, and you put it in a pot and you let it settle for a couple of days until it looks like a little bit weaker tea. I came to realize that faucets and drains are almost miraculous inventions and conveniences. That fogon, that sandbox stove that we had, just about drove me bananas at the beginning because it was always going out. I wasn't very good at keeping a fire going when the wood was always wet. I had to learn to fan it the way the Indian women did. And the gasoline pressure stove, which was supposed to be a modern convenience, was infuriatingly temperamental, and we were endlessly having to ream out the little pipe that fed the gasoline into the lamp. And when you would try to boil milk on it, of course it went without saying, that 9 times out of 10 the milk boiled over. And the books tell you that if you're going to boil your drinking water in order to be safe, it has to be boiled for 20 minutes. Well, to keep that gasoline pressure stove going steadily for 20 minutes was one of the neatest tricks of the year. And what do you do with butter, for example, if you have no refrigerator? Well, I discovered that if you submerge it in a jar with salt water, that it will keep, probably at least a week. We made jam out of apple parings, and we made our own bread and laboriously baked it in a tiny little oven which we set on top of the gasoline pressure stove. And we did have a pressure cooker, but not very long after we got there, it blew its safety valve right through the roof. I mean, literally, through the thatched roof. So that was the end of that, and life became simpler again. And I was always saying to myself, as soon as I get all this stuff done, as soon as I get all this under control, as soon as I learn to cope with these conveniences or lack of conveniences, then I can start serving God. The truth, of course, was that all of that, too, was a part of the will of God. It's not just brain work that God wants. It's not just spiritual work that God requires of us. I, the Lord, have called thee, he said, and very humble things can be very holy things if they are offered to him.
Part 3 of Humble Things. That was Humble Things Can Be Holy Things. Later on, we'll go to Part 4, An Unwritten Language. But first, let's hear from one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot, Elisabeth Martin. She talks about Elisabeth's southern accents, about her being interested in people but somehow overwhelmed by their needs. She loved to study people and to imitate them.
Joyce Grenfell is one of the people she loved to imitate. She had records of Joyce Grenfell, and she would play those records for me. She actually had some of them put onto a cassette tape and mailed them to me. When I was probably about 12, 13, 14, I started memorizing them. And it was because she said, I want you to memorize these so that you can do them for me when you come and visit. And so she taught me how to imitate the English accent by just giving me those cassette tapes. She loved Southern accent, but I think she had an interest in people. I think she loved people, but I don't think she often knew what to do with people. So it's kind of funny. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that as she was overwhelmed by the needs that were written to her about. So people would write her letters about their needs and their heartaches and their troubles. And she would sometimes get completely overwhelmed by it. But then she would say, but I've given them to the Lord. And I pray for every person who writes to me. And then she would write them back. So sometimes she'd get 300 letters in a week. And she would want to write all those people back. It's amazing that she would do that. But I do think she loved studying people. So she listened a lot and she watched. And then she would imitate, like you said. I think she found that easier than trying to come up with clever things to say back to them. she just thought they were funny. I mean, there was a lady, for instance, that she knew who would critique her wardrobe and tell her that she needed different shoes to go with that outfit. And this lady happened to be from Alabama, and she would just tell us about how her friend Jeannie told her that those shoes, Elisabeth, those shoes are not going to work. And she just would put on this accent. So I took that from her. That's one of the things I really love that she gave me, a love for imitation and mimicking people. But it was always done in love. It was never done to make fun of people. It was always done to help enhance, I think, also her memory of that person and to bring life to a story that she wanted to tell.
Elisabeth Martin, one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot. Later on, we'll hear about a very simple yet humble way that Elisabeth showed her love to a friend. Right now, though, let's move to part 4, an unwritten language. Elisabeth recognized early on that she had a gift in linguistics. She'll talk about reducing a language to writing, and about the importance, if you're a linguist, in finding an informant.
I didn't realize until I was a college student that there were about 2,000 languages that had been discovered by the time I graduated from college, which was way back in 1948. Now you can figure out how old I am. I hadn't realized that there were that many unwritten languages. The truth is that many of those 2,000 have now been reduced to writing, but in the meantime, more have been discovered. So I believe that the total of unwritten languages now is over 3,000. But I had given myself to God as a student in college for this kind of work. I had recognized a certain gift that God had given me in linguistics, and I put together that gift with the facts about unwritten languages, and I said, well, Lord, here I am, if you want to use me to reduce at least one of those languages to writing. And so it was in the providence of God that I had ended up in the western jungle of Ecuador, working with the tribe called the Colorado Indians. The first thing that a language worker needs is what we call an informant. That may sound a little bit threatening, but it simply means a person who can inform you about the language. Not teach you the language, but simply have the patience to sit there and speak over and over and over again phrases which for him are the easiest language in the world, and for the foreigner are apparently impossible. One of the things that makes it difficult for the poor informant is the suspicion that his student is probably retarded, because he doesn't seem able either to hear the language or to reproduce it very accurately, let alone understand it. And there he sits making all these strange marks on paper, which seems quite beside the point to the informant, and tomorrow he's going to make the same hilarious blunders all over again, peer intently into the informant's mouth while he speaks, and ask the same imbecile questions. Not very many people want a job like that. To my dismay, I learned that no Colorado Indian had ever worked for a white man. Certainly, no Colorado Indian was ever going to work for a white woman. What I had not realized was that these people were quite wealthy, because they raise a crop called achiote, a tree that bears a prickly pod that contains a very brilliant red dye that was used in this country for the coloring of margarine. I'm not sure if it's still used for that, but I know that the Colorados were quite wealthy because of exporting this dye. So they had no need of my money, and they didn't want a job such as the one that I was offering. Well, what does one do in a case like that? Obviously, you pray that the Lord will give you an informant. Well, I had not even seen one of these Indians yet. We lived in a small clearing inhabited only by white people, but I knew that the Indians were out there in the jungle, not very far away, maybe a couple of miles, 5 miles, 10 miles at the most. But one day I was out hanging up clothes when I looked up, just emerging from the green scrim of the jungle, came a Colorado Indian on horseback. I couldn't have mistaken him for anything else. He was painted brilliant red from head to foot. He was wearing a black and white striped miniskirt. He had flung over his shoulders yellow and turquoise scarves, which were flying in the wind as he rode, and he had what looked like a red helmet on his head. That was surmounted by a circle of white cotton. I couldn't believe my eyes. As he approached us, I said to Doreen, my colleague, I said, "What is the helmet for?" "Helmet?" she shrieked. "That's his hair." "That's not a helmet, Betty. Don't you know that's his hair?" Maybe it sounded something like that. Anyway, that was Doreen. She was a hilariously funny colleague to have, and I was always teasing her about her English accent, and of course, with very good reason, she teased me about my American. But we tried to get the Indians to work for us, even just to pause long enough for 10 or 15 minutes to give us some of the language, but we were not successful, and so we continued to pray that God would give us an informant. And God answered that prayer, exceeding abundantly above what I had asked or thought, and he gave us not an Indian, but a man named Macario, a white man who spoke both Spanish and Colorado, an advantage that I had not even thought of praying for. I knew that the Colorados spoke very little Spanish, barely enough to do their trading with the white people, but not enough to converse or be of a very great help to me. So here was a man who had grown up on an hacienda with Colorado children and spoke both languages fluently. Macario was not only willing to work for me, he was out of a job, he was prepared to work at my price, and to my utter amazement, he was a Christian and eager to work at what he saw to be the work of God, missionary work. And so we began to work very happily together. It was not very long after we had begun to work together that one of the most exciting experiences that I had been looking forward to took place. I knew that Doreen and Barbara did a certain amount of medical work. They were not qualified doctors, but they had gone through the London Missionary School of Medicine, as they called it, and knew quite a bit about tropical medicine and also about very practical things like giving worm medicine and injections of penicillin and delivering babies. And it was to see a baby delivered that I was most eager. So I was delighted when Doreen called me one day and said, "Come, we're going to deliver a baby." Well, there was the young mother, panting and sweating, sitting on a board bed in a very tiny house, probably about 10 by 10 feet square. Doreen bustled around busily and got somebody to boil some water, and she had some strips of sheeting and a sterilized pair of scissors there with her, and the basic minimum necessities for such an event. And as the progress of the birth moved on, Doreen was explaining things to me, and finally, lo and behold, just as predicted and just as pictured, here came this little black head emerging into the world, and that to me was a tremendous thrill, to see a perfectly normal birth. But not long after that, I was awakened in the middle of the night by Doreen calling me to go quickly over to Maruja's house. Maruja, I knew, was a woman who belonged to several men. They seemed to be father and two sons, all of whom shared one woman. We knew that Maruja had quite a flock of small children and had had many difficulties in previous births and had come to Doreen for help with this pregnancy. When Doreen examined her, she could tell that things were not likely to be entirely normal, so she begged Maruja to go to the hospital to have this baby. Her men, husbands, whatever you want to call them, had listened seriously to Doreen, we thought, and said, "Oh, yes, it's very grave indeed. We do understand. Yes, we will take her to the hospital. No, we will not call you. Yes, we understand." Doreen said, "You know, she may die if you don't get her to a hospital." They didn't get her to a hospital. They called us in the middle of the night. We rushed over. We found Maruja groaning and crying on the bed. There was quite a lot of blood around, and we had no idea whether the baby was born or not. We assumed that it was not. But then suddenly I heard a small sound behind me, and I turned, and there was the tiny baby lying in a bundle of absolutely filthy rags over in a corner all by itself. The men were standing there lifting up their eyes to heaven, praying all sorts of prayers to Mary and Joseph and Jesus and God and everybody they could think of. But there seemed to be practically nothing that we could do. And although we treated Maruja for shock, it was too late, and we had to watch her die. This was the first blow to my faith in my missionary work. We had really prayed very hard for this woman. We had done what we could to persuade them to get proper help. Then we had done all that we could that night, and we stood there and watched her breathe her last. It was my first experience of having to face the imponderables, the unanswerable questions. Had God let us down? This was a family that we had tried to witness to, a family that we had hoped had been paying attention to the gospel, and now they blamed us because of the death of Maruja. I realized that it was not a tidy world. I felt let down, I felt forsaken, I felt baffled. In Lamentations, the 3rd chapter, I read this: I am the man who has known affliction. I have felt the rod of his wrath. It was I whom he led away and left to walk in darkness, where no light is. He has barred my road with blocks of stone and tangled up my way. Let him sit alone and sigh if it is heavy upon him. Let him lay his face in the dust. Let him turn his cheek to the smiter and endure full measure of abuse, for the Lord will not cast off his servants forever. He may punish cruelly, yet he will have compassion in the fullness of his love. He does not willingly afflict or punish any mortal man. Sometimes it seems as though God does, in fact, willingly afflict and punish some of us poor mortals. I really felt depressed about Maruja's death. And yet the Lord reminded me again, the Lord God will help me, therefore shall I not be confounded. Remember that every experience, if offered to Jesus, can be your gateway to joy.
Part 4 of Humble Things, that's an 8-part series. That was called An Unwritten Language. Before we go, we'll hear from one of the friends of Elisabeth Elliot, Kathy Gilbert. She talks about how Elisabeth was willing to treat her as not an interruption, but to show her love instead.
So what surprised me most about Elisabeth? How funny and fun she was. She had such a dry sense of humor. For example, her teaching on women in missions, she read this sappy description of single women missionaries and then, with a straight face, said, "That was written by a man." And you should have heard the audience go wild. They love her. Now, another surprising thing about Elisabeth, when she and Lars would travel, and of course, if you know her, you know that they traveled constantly, between the two of them, they would carry one carry-on suitcase. Isn't that amazing that that woman could travel so light and share a little suitcase, a carry-on suitcase with her husband? Unfortunately, not me. And in August of 1909, I got to visit her in her home. And she lived in Magnolia, Massachusetts, right on the coast, and it's beautiful. And we took a walk around her neighborhood and along the coast. And as I'm walking through her beautiful town of Magnolia, I'm looking around. I'm just exclaiming oohs and ahs at all the beauty. But what was Elisabeth doing? Elisabeth was looking down in the weeds, rummaging for bottles to recycle, because she brought her plastic bag, and she did find bottles to recycle. But another amazing thing, about that time I got to visit her, I would be downstairs puttering around, reading some books, but then I decided I wanted to go upstairs and visit her in her office. And what I'm amazed at now, I didn't realize it then, what she was doing, but she would put down whatever she was doing to talk. And what a challenge that must have been. Elisabeth is very disciplined, structured. She had her routine in the morning, and she had so much mail and things to write and respond to, and a lot of time was taken up with that. But for her just to put down whatever she was doing to talk taught me as she always would say, but now she practiced it, to look at interruptions as from Jesus. And this woman practiced what she preached.
A friend of Elisabeth, Kathy Gilbert. And maybe you'd like to leave a message for us that we can use possibly on a future program. You can go to elisabethelliott.org, go to the podcast section, and then share a message. There's a button there for that. Probably the easiest way to do it is to do it with your phone and just leave that message if you'd like to do that. Thanks. Well, for a variety of resources, go to elisabethelliott.org, videos, more talks, devotionals, and more. elisabethelliott.org. But until we meet again, may God keep reminding you, you're loved with an everlasting love. Underneath are those everlasting arms.